The decline of Leinster football. So if by chance you end up in a pub anywhere in the country, or by chance you end up in some sort of GAA circle and you happen to mention the Leinster Championship, you will usually get a response something like this.
I'm so fucking tired of this shit. Fuck this shit. Fuck you fucking dirty.
The Leinster Championship is that one topic of conversation in GAA circles that a lot of the time doesn't even warrant a conversation. Mainly because the conversation will go down the lines of the amount of one-sided games that are in the championship, the fact that Dublin have won it 13 years in a row and they basically don't even care about it anymore themselves, the fact that nobody can come anywhere close to Dublin, the fact that Meath and Kildare have regressed hugely along with half the province, or the fact that Croke Park has seen a huge dip in attendances over the last 15 years, in which Dublin play almost every game. The Leinster Championship is just that one championship in Gaelic football, in the GAA, that people really just don't want to talk about, and it's a formality really. And see, when you know more or less exactly what's going to happen time and time again, it even makes the discussion seem somewhat boring and pointless because, as I said, it's a formality. We know who's going to win the competition year on year. We know more or less who's going to challenge Dublin. And even challenging them is kind of rare in the Leinster Championship when you actually look at some of the margin of victories. And whilst Dublin have been enjoying themselves in the competition, the rest of the teams in the competition have just fallen considerably. Dublin's trajectory has gone up, and everyone else, in particular Meath and Kildare's trajectory, has gone way down. It's resulted in this completely unbalanced championship where you've got one team who's at their absolute peak of their powers and the rest who are just nowhere even near competing the best team. And whether those two reasons are aligned is what we're going to discuss in today's video. Is Dublin's trajectory going up? Meath and Kildare's trajectory going down? Are they somewhat connected? Is the fact that Dublin are so good in the Leinster Championship the reason that Kildare and Meath have been so poor in the Leinster Championship in the last 10-15 years? It's an interesting topic of conversation, so let's discuss. And when you think of the Leinster Championship today, you think of the fact that Dublin has won the competition in the last 13 years with absolute ease, with the last 10 Leinster finals being won by a margin bigger than 7 points. And when it comes to predicting the Leinster Championship or previewing it in any other way, it comes to that cloud of, we know how this will end regardless of how well other counties in the province perform. And to be fair, most people who are watching this video will probably know that the Leinster Championship was not always this way, as there was a point in time in the 2000s when Croke Park would be fully packed for Leinster finals, Leinster semi-finals and even Leinster quarter-finals. The Leinster quarter-final in 2007 between Dublin and Meath drew an attendance of 78,000, and that was the regular back then. A Leinster quarter-final drawing an attendance of 78,000. A Leinster quarter-final in Croke Park nowadays probably wouldn't even draw 30,000. It's remarkable how quickly and how fast the decline has been in attendances in the last 10 years or so. The 2005, 2006, 2007 and 2008 Leinster finals were fully packed with every single ticket available sold. The 2009 Leinster final had 74,000. The attendance averaged between 45 to 70,000 for the next 5 years before it eventually did start to decline year after year after year after year. And it mainly started to decline around 2013-2014 when Dublin just started becoming this absolute juggernaut of a team and just powered their way through almost every championship with one eye closed. And of course, with the appetite for the competition not being there anymore, it's no surprise to see the sharp decline and drop in attendances over the last 15 years or so. To Dublin fans, winning the competition was seen as a given, and the majority of Dublin fans now would probably rather save their money for an All-Ireland Championship, semi-final or final, or games that are going to be more entertaining and ultimately more value for money. And if you're going to just see your team hammer the opposition week after week, you know exactly what's going to happen. You know when Dublin play the likes of Laois and Croke Park, Kildare, Meath or Louth, it's going to end up in one way. So ultimately, as a fan, and for most casual fans who obviously have a lot of, you got to spend a lot of money on things nowadays, why would you go to Croke Park when ultimately you know that when a quarter-final, semi-final, or if you can get tickets for an All-Ireland final come around, it would make so much more sense to spend your money then, rather than spend your money on this when realistically it's just going to be over at half time. And of course that's not every fan, but you could argue the majority of fans nowadays just don't have much of an interest in the Leinster Championship at all. Even myself at times, who would have gone to Leinster Championship games religiously growing up, Nowadays, it's like, I'll go to the game because it's an occasion and I want to watch a good, exciting game of football. But am I going to be hugely entertained? Am I going to come out of the game thinking, wow, Dublin, what a performance against Louth? Absolutely not, because in more ways than one, it's a given. And that's just Dublin fans who are already in the county and don't have to travel a huge amount of distance to Croke Park. At the end of the day, at least your senior team win a game of football, and majority of times they're doing it playing brilliant, exciting, attacking football. It is enjoyable. It's probably just not enjoyable to actually be there, because ultimately it's just going to result in a completely one-sided game, a dead atmosphere, and you're probably just better off going to the pub and watching it instead. But as I said, that's Dublin fans. So imagine fans in Leinster who are not from Dublin, who have to year after year after year see scorelines like this and this and this. It's bound to have an effect on supporters not wanting to come to Croke Park to see them games, and to be honest, you can't blame them. Like, making that trip to Croke Park, getting absolutely hammered, a complete distance to travel, it just feels like a complete waste of time. You do have to commend the fans who do make the trip to Croke Park, in fairness, and for those fans, I salute you. You come, you support your county no matter what, and you are a true GA fan, and without people like you, I struggle to know where the GA would be, to be honest with you. But ultimately, how did we go from action-packed sellout crowds on Leinster final day to a mere pre-season inevitable Leinster final winner in such a quick and sudden short space of time? Throughout the history of the Leinster Championship in the 80s, the 90s and 2000s, it was never like that. And that's probably why the attendances were so good. Throughout the history of the Leinster Championship, it was regarded as one of the most competitive, most entertaining provinces to watch, with 3, 4, sometimes even 5 counties all feeling they had a chance to win it on any given day. It's only really been in the last 10 to 15 years where the championship has lost its respect, and here's why. Firstly, as I said, when one team dominates as much as Dublin have year after year after year, when other provinces have been far more competitive and thriving, it does make the competition look a little bit silly, in all honesty. And the Dublin dominance discussion is certainly a topic that could be discussed in another video if people were interested in it, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail covering it now, but we will scratch the surface ever so slightly just to see how Dublin went from a side who were struggling to win Leinster Championships to ultimately winning this competition with their eyes closed. Let's say through the 1990s right up until the early 2000s, Dublin was a county that was rapidly growing in terms of economy, population, and demand for sport, and in particular GAA. Attendances were at an all-time high. The Celtic Tiger era was one of the most prosperous and best eras for the GAA in terms of income. But one thing during it all was failing, and failing quite miserably. In fact, it was in danger of completely falling into the abyss, and that was Dublin GAA. You see, other sports had grown hugely during that time period in the 70s, 80s and 90s, in particular soccer, rugby and athletics. And sure, GAA and Gaelic football in particular was a sport that was in demand too. Huge demand, as a matter of fact, which is ultimately what led us into the machine that is Dublin GAA today, and why the Leinster Championship has become the way it is. Huge amount of demand for GAA meant that clubs needed more facilities, more coaches, more teams, more training, more pitches, more resources, more money. And with Croke Park being in Dublin, it only made sense that the more Dublin played in Croke Park, the more the sport would grow in the city, the more attendances would grow, and it would result in more growth around Dublin GAA, and ultimately it would yield a return on investment that would be put into Dublin GAA. The GAA ultimately knew that Dublin was one of its biggest assets in terms of the population, the demographic, in terms of the potential that could be achieved with Dublin GAA should they go on and be successful, and should they be able to keep up and attract these attendances game after game after game. So ultimately for the GAA, it only made sense to give Dublin what they needed, which was resources to fit the demands of clubs which were hugely on the up throughout the entirety of the county, and that's what happened. Through time, clubs started becoming bigger, underage teams benefited, players coming through started to get better and better, ultimately leading it to the Dublin juggernaut that is today. And of course, money and resources is not everything in sport. It's not the sole reason why Dublin have become the team that they were most recently, winning 6 All-Irelands in a row. Some of the players Dublin have produced have been the most technically gifted footballers that we have ever seen, and it would be unfair to label Dublin that the only reason they achieved this success was down to the resources that was pumped into them, and that they only achieved what they achieved because of money, basically. It all played a role, yes, but not the sole factor to Dublin's success. And to be fair, you have to give Dublin credit for using the resources and actually investing time into players, coaches, facilities in order to become the best that they can be. The same can't always be said for other counties, in all honesty. And whilst Dublin's work behind the scenes was setting Dublin up on the pitch to become the team that would go on and dominate the Leinster Championship in the way that we know today, something else was happening which would result in the decline of the Leinster Championship. And that was the huge fall in competition. You see, through history, Meath and Kildare will be seen as Dublin's biggest competitors if we were to look at the overall history of the Leinster Championship, especially more recent history of the Leinster Championship. Meath have won the competition on 21 occasions, the most recent being 2010, a final that is quite tainted, to be honest with you. 4 of Meath's Leinster titles came in the 1990s and 3 in the 1980s. The Royals are currently on its longest drought of the Leinster Championship since the 44 years they went without winning it since 1895 to 1944. Kildare have won the competition on 13 occasions. Interestingly enough, however, they have only won it twice since 1956. That came in 1998 and 2000s. Kildare have been runners-up, however, on 23 occasions. That's the joint most alongside Dublin, and no side has lost in more Leinster finals since winning the competition than Kildare. Wexford have won the competition on 10 occasions, the most recent in 1945. Offaly have also won it on 10 times, the most recent in 1997. Louth have won it 8 times, Laois have won it 6 times, Kilkenny have won it 3 times. Wait, what? Kilkenny won the Leinster Championship on 3 occasions. Westmeath and Carlow have won it on 1 occasion, and Wicklow have never won it. And in the 2000s, it just felt like the Leinster Championship was at its absolute peak. Laois winning it in 2003, Westmeath winning it in 2004, Offaly getting to the final in 2006, Meath and Kildare proving as a stiff test for the Dubs in their 4-in-a-row spell, Wexford's rise getting to the final in 2011, just 3 years after an All-Ireland semi-final appearance in 2008. Leinster football was strong, and when it came to the All-Ireland series, most Leinster teams did well. And yes, the Leinster Championship has been the way it's been over the last 10 to 15 years because of the dominance of Dublin. But what I done was I looked at Leinster teams outside of the Leinster Championship in the All-Ireland series from 2000 to 2010 and compared them with 2011 right up until today to show that Leinster teams through 2000 to 2010 were very competitive even outside the Leinster Championship, but Leinster teams from 2011 up until today haven't been, and the results right now will show why. You see, between 2000 and 2010 there were 20 appearances from Leinster teams other than Dublin in the All-Ireland series, and that's the quarter-finals and above. Meath, Kildare and Wexford all had years where they reached an All-Ireland semi-final, and Meath even played in the All-Ireland final in 2001. And as I said, the reason why I mentioned that is, do you want to know how many appearances Leinster teams made in the All-Ireland series, once again, quarter-finals and above, other than Dublin? How many would you think? 6 appearances. 6 appearances. 20 appearances from Leinster teams between 2000 and 2010. 6 appearances between 2011 and today. If you wanted to be technical, you could say, well, there was Super 8s in 2018 and 2019, so that should make 10 appearances because Meath would have played 2 more games and Kildare would have played 2 more games. But Kildare and Meath both lost all of those games, and they would have been knocked out in an All-Ireland quarter-final. It was just that the GAA had this interesting new format instead. So how did that happen then? How did the competition that Dublin had to compete with do so well, even outside the Leinster Championship, and completely fall off a cliff what seemed almost overnight? Well, firstly, Laois and Westmeath went through golden eras into the 2000s. Both had legendary managers, and in fairness, when you look through the history of them two counties, that time period was a unique time period, and both have dramatically fallen off since. But in fairness to both Laois and Westmeath, it was a unique time period, and you can't really judge them for falling off because, to be fair, through the 70s, 80s, 90s and the history of the GAA, generally speaking, the history of the Leinster Championship, Westmeath and Laois were usually not that good. Them being so good in the 2000s was quite a unique time period, to be honest. Westmeath have seen more good days than Laois have seen good days in that time period, but they have been few and far between for both of those two counties since. Wexford's rise in the 2000s was also a bit of a golden era and seemed to be a once-off since their glory days pre-1945. Nowadays they're languishing around Division 4 and are probably one of the lowest ranked teams in the province. To think Wexford nearly won the Leinster Championship in 2011, whereas now they can barely even win a game in Leinster. Offaly competed well, but that was mostly built off their 1990s team, and once that era was over, Offaly football has fallen off a cliff and probably still picking up the pieces today, in all honesty. When you look at Kildare, they have won just 2 provincial titles since 1956, and to be honest, as a county, they've probably always somewhat underachieved. Kildare have had some great players, but can never find any consistency, and they're always that type of team that one day can shock a big team and next can lose to a team they're expected to beat comfortably. A perfect example of that is in 2018 when Kildare beat Mayo in an All-Ireland qualifier. They also lost to Carlow in the Leinster Championship just a few weeks previous. And then Meath. Meath's drop off over the last 15 years has been crazy, really. You see, Meath were always the constant in the Leinster Championship alongside Dublin. In the 80s and 90s, when Dublin were competing for Leinster Championships, Meath were always there. In fact, Meath, you would argue, were better than Dublin in that time period, and All-Irelands wise, it probably shows for it, and Leinster Championships wise, it probably shows for it. And eras came and went for every other county, like we mentioned, but Meath were always there. But since about the mid-2000s, Meath have just fallen dramatically. One appearance in the last 8 of the All-Ireland since 2011 and countless embarrassing defeats. It's been bad for Meath. And again, it's probably another video for another day to discuss what exactly has happened to Meath in the last 15 years or so. Because to be honest with you, I honestly don't know. Has Dublin's rise contributed to Meath and the rest of Leinster's downfall? It's hard to know, to be honest. And whilst Dublin does clearly have a hugely unfair advantage over the rest of the country in terms of population and resources, Meath and Kildare themselves still have more resources than most other counties around the country, which, as I said, makes their fall quite unusual. Was there a lack of investment in the 2000s, a neglection of underage, and maybe the county is paying the price today? Has facilities not been updated through time? Have players just dried up? It's honestly hard to know. Could it be that Dublin became so good that younger players lost interest, ultimately looked at Dublin winning Leinster Championships year after year and thought, I just don't fancy playing for Meath when we have to compete with that? One thing for certain though is that the blame cannot always be pointed towards Dublin, which as a county sometimes has been made out to be the problem in all of this. As I said before, the last time a Leinster team other than Dublin made an All-Ireland semi-final was Kildare in 2010. 6 appearances in the last 8 of the All-Ireland from Leinster teams from 2011 up until today, and some defeats have even been as bad as this. Some results have been as bad as this. And the last time a team from Leinster other than Dublin finished in Division 1 without getting relegated was Kildare in 2013. So it's fair to say that Dublin, look, they're a juggernaut, and to be fair, there was a time period where probably only Mayo or Kerry could compete with Dublin for a long time. But if you look through the teams in Leinster, a lot of the time they're not even competing with the top 8 in the country, the top 10 in the country, let alone Dublin. So whilst the huge shift and there's been a huge blame pointed towards Dublin, and to be fair, some of it is warranted, you also have to look at it and think, well, what exactly are these counties even doing outside of the Leinster Championship? And the answer is very little. And see, Leinster teams have been so fixated on competing with what has been one of the greatest teams of a generation, let alone just a great team or a greatest team in Leinster. This Dublin team that won 6 All-Irelands in a row and that have obviously continued on the trend of winning Leinster Championships and have currently won 13 Leinster titles in a row. Like, that team was one of the greatest of all time, and there was only 2 teams in the country in that 6-year spell that could compete with Dublin, and that was Mayo and Kerry, and they didn't even beat them. And these Leinster teams through the 1990s and 2000s have competed with the best year on year, and some of them have even won All-Ireland titles. So whilst you look at Dublin and their dominance, you also look at it and think, what have these counties done in the back door? What have these counties done in the All-Ireland series? And it's been very little. And what's interesting is when you look at the Dublin team that has won 13 Leinster titles in a row, I often wonder if you put that Dublin team in the side through the mid-2000s, would they have won Leinster Championship as easily? I don't think they would have. Would they have been as dominant? Probably. When you look at Dublin in 2021, when you look at Dublin this year, if there was a team there that was capable of beating this Dublin side, if there was a team there that was capable of challenging Dublin and Leinster, they're more than capable of dethroning this Dublin side. All of this that I've mentioned has resulted in Leinster fading into obscurity, and the competition has just unfortunately become a massive farce. However, with Dublin's golden generation of players slowly coming to an end, Kildare having a huge amount of success at underage level, as of Offaly and Meath, maybe, just maybe, the championship might not be away from returning to its best days in the mid-2000s. Until then, however, we will keep having the same conversations over and over again with no solution. Maybe we'll even see more appearances on the Sunday game from managers who are there to discuss how the Leinster Championship is just a bit of a mess. And so what is the solution? With Kildare hugely growing at underage level, you would say that maybe we should just let it be, and maybe Kildare, Meath will make up the ground. But what if they don't make up the ground? What if it ultimately Dublin keep on winning and we get to the stage where Dublin win 20 Leinster titles in a row? 20 Leinster titles in a row. Like, that's bad. To be honest, I'm not sure what the actual solution is, and thankfully enough, I'm not the guy to make the solution. But here is maybe some ideas. We could see the Leinster Championship in the same format as the Ladies Championship, so that we would drown out some of the absolute mismatches from All-Ireland quarterfinals, and we would get the competition over and done with quicker. We could move the Leinster Championship to become a pre-season competition, and ultimately we could move all provincial championships to the start of the year, replacing pre-season tournaments and ultimately taking away the weight of Leinster of provincial championships, essentially. But whether that is the solution, I don't know. Some people have called for provincial championships to just be scrapped altogether. I don't entirely agree with that, because when you look at the Ulster Championship, you look at the Connacht Championship, you look at some of the scenes in the Munster Championship in 2020, and whenever the day does come that Dublin get beat in the Leinster Championship, it will be an extraordinary day in the history of the Leinster Championship. So, like, I don't think scrapping them is the solution. If you moved them earlier in the year, I could agree, but at the same time, provincial championships should mean something. Just because one team has been so dominant and the championship has been so lopsided doesn't mean it should ruin it for everybody else. So whatever happens next, I don't know, but something does need to be done, in fairness. Let me know your thoughts on this video. Let me know your thoughts on the fall of Leinster football. It's been quite the rise and fall of Leinster football in the last 20 years. And as I said, there was a time period through the 2000s where Leinster football was at its absolute peak. Will we ever get back to them days? I'm not entirely sure. It would be great. Even as a Dublin fan, I would love to see the Leinster Championship be really competitive. And I would even take, as a Dublin fan, Dublin losing in the Leinster Championship for a couple of years if it meant that the Leinster Championship got back to the way we once had it. Because those days were memorable days. And even as a kid, I remember the 2005 Leinster final, Dublin beating Laois. And I remember coming out of Croke Park and being like, that was a great feeling. Whereas today, Dublin beat Laois in Croke Park. Who cares? Anyway, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. See y'all later.